moderator for even the breakout sessions, especially here or the other breakout rooms, please ensure that you see our technical team so we can schedule it and be ready to go ahead of time. So tafadhali, make sure that you see this team here, and I believe there's Dr. Gakuya. So you come ako kwa room. I think he's making sure people are here. Anyone else from the team that any presenter can see, you could just stand up real quick so that they could identify you. At the end of the day yesterday, we didn't have all the presentations, but I believe more people have sent in. And I'm still talking just to give a bit more minute and time for our delegates who are walking in. Karibuni nyote, I'm encouraging us to sit up front. There's plenty of space here. So karibuni nyote. For those who are not with us for day one of the second edition of the International Scientific Conference, my name is Mark Masai. I'll be your moderator. So I'll be in your faces. He was encouraged.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. It's delightful to be here again for the second One Life Scientific Conference. Let me first congratulate WRTI for keeping this up, for keeping us connected around science and research, and also for enabling us to participate, whether by presentation or by attending the sessions. I think this is the only forum I've seen in Kenya so far that's really bringing us together. And as someone said this morning, we tend to meet here more than we meet in Nairobi. So maybe we should do this annually, but we're happy to have it every 2 years. So my name is Lucy Warunge, the Director of African Conservation Center. I'm also currently the Chair of the One Life Conservation Trust Fund, which is established as an entity to look at sustainable financing for conservation, whether for parks, for conservancies, for research, for communities. And so really delighted to be here. Our keynote, we're doing it jointly with Dr. Anika Healy, and she works with the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, who has been a partner with us in ACC, looking at connectivity and looking at informing the space of ecosystems and the areas that need to remain connected for this wildlife and people to thrive. And our presentation is really looking at how do we conserve these connected spaces for wildlife and people, and I'll be giving you a short outline as we go along. So welcome, Anika. I hope you can hear us.
Yes, good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be able to... Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. We're very excited to be part of this, and I wish I could have joined you in person, but I'm happy to be able to come to you from Vienna.
All right, thank you. I think I'll ask for the laptop. The clicker doesn't seem to be working. Thank you.
And Lucy, as you continue, once you're done with the 1 hour session, we'll have an opportunity for interaction, and that session will be chaired by Dr. Albert Longora, who is up front there on standby. But we just got started just to catch up on time, but he will chair that session. So jot your notes down, your questions or comments as you follow this presentation. Karibu.
Thank you. So our outline, we are going to look at the benefits of migration. We'll look at some of the IUCN connectivity guidelines that are in place to inform the basic principles that we should be considering as we look at connectivity. We'll look at corridor legislation around the world. We'll also look at models that have been done in validating corridors in the transboundary area of Kenya and southern Kenya and northern Tanzania. And we'll look at options that are available for protecting corridors. And finally, a case study, Kenyan case studies on corridors. So of course, when you think of migration in Kenya, and probably around the world, one of the pictures that comes up often in people's mind and in a lot of the photography is wildebeests, because they're known indeed as the largest population that migrates in huge distances in Africa. A spectacle to behold that's become a pressure point for visitors, especially in the Mara. But what is it that drives these migrations? What is it that enables them to be a heartbeat and a rhythm for sustaining conservation? How does connectivity play into enabling migrations to be viable conduits of building species viability and populations over time? And so even as much as we look at this spectacle, it only exists because there's a rhythm and there's a rhyme to how these corridors are connected. And it really lends to our understanding of the importance of connectivity conservation. It's one thing to conserve species, it's one thing to conserve space, but it's important to think about the connectivity between that. And I want to start with some data. And I'm glad to hear that the head of public service said we need to respect scientists, because data gives you facts, and facts don't lie. And one of the benefits we have is long-term data that has looked at, in this case, habitats. And I want us to look at the benefits of migration from understanding the value of the habitats in those migration. What you're looking at there is 3 graphs that show 3 different types of habitats: bushland, plains, and swamps. And a crude protein value was calculated by harvesting the different vegetation types in these areas. And what was clear is that you get your highest protein gain by consuming the grass in the bushland, followed by the plains, followed by the swamps. So as wildlife moves from the bushland to the plains to the swamps, they're moving across a protein gradient. And that ability of moving between the high protein value to the lower protein values enables them to keep following the green wave and building their energy bonus. And the data that has been done in the research of the Amboseli Conservation Program with Dr. Weston and others show that they gain 40 to 60% of the energy they need by migrating than if they didn't. So there is a benefit of migration driven directly from the habitat. And my last graph on this is that there's also looking at the grazing, and this is the indicator of the value of these habitats as they migrate. If you look at the percentage of bushland, plains, woodlands, and swamps that are grazed, you have a highest percentage grazed in the bushland, following the plains and the woodlands and the swamps. And so what this means is that when you come from a wet season and the animals are moving straight across into the dry season, they are following the habitat availability across these habitat types. So this is also to say that the heterogeneity of the habitats in these migratory and connectivity areas is critical. It's not adequate to just have a space that we call a connected space. It's important to understand what are the habitat types in that space, and do they lend themselves to enabling wildlife and livestock to build the energy bonus that they need as they migrate. So I thought that was a useful context of seeing the benefits, not just from movement, but also from the benefits of the protein gain across these habitats. And IUCN has some guidelines, and I'll hand over to Annika to share what IUCN has guided on connectivity guidelines.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, following up on the importance on connectivity. So I'm speaking a second after I say it. Can we turn that off somehow?
It's breaking slightly. Annika, can you hear us well?
I can hear you well.
There seems to be a break in
I
the
can
sound.
also hear myself speaking through your speakers.
I won't take it for granted that we all have interacted personally or professionally directly with Dr. Annika. So as we sort out that line, and I'm sure we all have the booklet in hand and all the bios and the profiles. So for those who haven't managed to go through that, Dr. Annika Keeley works at the Center for Large Landscape Conservation, where she focuses her work on ecological connectivity. Now, she has contributed papers on modeling, measuring, and implementing connectivity, and she helped write the IUCN's guidelines for conserving connectivity through ecological networks and corridors. As a co-author, she updated the book Corridor Ecology, Linking Landscapes for Biodiversity Conservation and Climate Adaptation with the most current science. With her team, she now supports partners in connectivity conservation planning, implementation, and monitoring at local, national, and regional scales, and works on answering science questions that come up in the process. Dr. Anika, I know it's a bit weird to hear about your accolades, but I hope you could hear clearly and that we got it accurate.
Okay. Can you hear her on the mics?
At least I
I
heard
can
your
hear her here.
affirmative response. We're just sorting out the audio to be able to hear you better. Sorry about that, Dr. Anika Keeley. And we have a timekeeper who will be gracious and will be able to accommodate the delays and the technical hitch. So to Lucy and to Dr. Anika, you'll have your allocated time. Don't you worry. We'll keep restarting the timer until it is aligned. So don't you worry about that. Your time will be compensated. And we really do appreciate, I believe Vienna is an hour ahead. Thank you for keeping your schedule open for us, Dr. Anika. And also thank you to Lucy Warwenge, who drove all the way early this morning and made sure she was here, I think one of the first to get into Kiboko Hall at 7:15. So asante sana to Lucy Warwenge, who, as we continue sorting that out, if in the unlikely event you do not know Lucy Warwenge. In fact, last time we were together, so I asked her today, is there a PhD, is there a doctor, professor? She said, don't worry, just call me Lucy. But the PhD and all is on its way. So Lucy Warwenge is the executive director of the African Conservation Center, ACC. She holds a BSc in computer science and statistics from the University of Nairobi and an MSc, beg your pardon, in geographic information systems from Manchester Metropolitan University, UK. Now, she is currently pursuing a PhD, and true to her word, at the University of Toronto, focusing on integrating indigenous knowledge and natural capital valuation. With over 2 decades of experience, Lucy is recognized leader in the application of geoinformatics, spatial and integrated planning and biodiversity knowledge to inform conservation policy, practice, and landscape management. She has led several national and international initiatives, including the development of biodiversity, informatics platforms, national strategies, wildlife connectivity assessments, and regional research on biodiversity and infrastructure. Her work also contributes to CBD reporting and conservation advocacy in Africa. Lucy served as the founding chair of the Conservation Alliance of Kenya, CAK, and currently serves as a chairperson of the Wildlife Conservation Trust Fund and sits on several advisory and technical boards advancing conservation science and practice. And hence why she's our keynote speaker alongside Dr. Anika to start us off.
Looks like we're still having trouble. We might need to make a plan B. Anika, can you hear us? Okay, unfortunately, we are only hearing you. We can only hear you on the laptop. Can we use the mic? Can we put the speaker onto? Anika, could you try and speak and we'll just mic you directly.
Okay, does that work?
Can you hear?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think let's proceed. How do I get my screen back? So Anika, you can continue, yes.
Well, let's jump in then and talk about the IUCN connectivity guidelines that were published in 2020 by the IUCN Connectivity Conservation Specialist Group of the IUCN. And the guidelines are now available in 6 languages, and they are the leading resource for best practices for safeguarding ecological networks that preserve, improve, and repair connectivity across across both intact and human-dominated systems. Next slide, please. The purpose of these guidelines is really to increase the use of especially corridors as a conservation tool to launch forward connectivity conservation. The guidelines are consolidating a wealth of knowledge and best available practices. They're including concrete guidelines of what a conserved ecological corridor is, and I will talk about that. They are also recommending the designation of ecological corridors to be recognized in international, regional, national, and subnational policy and law, and we will talk about that aspect as well. And they are recommending conserved ecological corridors to be tracked in a world database on ecological corridors. Next slide. One of the key elements of the guidelines are policy and scientific definitions for ecological connectivity, for functional connectivity, structural connectivity, ecological corridors, and ecological networks. And what I've seen in the last years is that having a go-to definition for these terms has become really important for making sure we are all speaking about the same thing as we are using these different terms. And so I want to emphasize here that two definitions. One is the definition for ecological networks for conservation. And these are systems of core habitats, and core habitats can be protected areas, other area-based effective conservation measures, or OECMs in short, or other intact natural areas that are not necessarily protected. But these core habitats need to be connected by ecological corridors, which are established, restored as needed, and maintained to conserve biological diversity in systems that have been fragmented. And an ecological corridor is defined as a clearly defined geographical space that it's governed and managed over the long term to maintain, enhance, or restore effective ecological connectivity. The table here shows the different similarities and differences between protected and conserved areas and ecological corridors. And what I want to point out is that ecological corridors really only need to achieve their defined connectivity objectives, whereas protected areas and conserved areas may provide connectivity but must provide in situ conservation. Okay, next slide. There are a few fundamental principles of ecological corridors. And one is that they are not a substitute for protected areas or OECMs. It's really a third type of protection here. So we have protected areas, we have OECMs, and then ecological corridors as a third type of protection. Ecological corridors should be identified and established in areas where conservation. Each corridor should have specific ecological objectives. So it has to be clear what purpose they are supposed to fulfill ecologically. And they need to be governed and managed to achieve the connectivity outcomes. Ecological corridors may consist partly or entirely of natural areas managed primarily for connectivity. And they should be differentiated from non-designated areas by specific uses that are allowed or prohibited within that. So thinking about management, you need to be clear what can how it's managed differently from the surrounding area. To achieve their connectivity objectives, ecological corridors require their own management plan. And that's true for all terrestrial, freshwater, or marine corridors, as the case may be. All right, next slide. One thing it's really important to note is that ecological corridors should be clearly delineated. So they need to have agreed upon boundaries, and they need to be large enough to achieve the specific ecological objectives over the long term. So So the idea is that even if outside of the boundaries of the corridor, there's intense human use of the landscape, the corridor is still facilitating wildlife movement and fulfilling its ecological objective. So it needs to be wide enough, large enough to do that. And it's for sites that are crossing political or jurisdictional boundaries for which it's not feasible to have a common governance mechanism, separate ecological corridors may need to be delineated that then form one system. Okay, next slide, please. Let's talk a little bit about governance. Overall, effective ecological corridor governance requires building trust, working towards shared values and goals, and developing collaboration across the full range of interests involved. Governance arrangements should be clearly articulated in the documentation of the corridor. And as with protected areas and OECM governance, ecological corridor governance has three components: how and by whom decisions are made, and who should be held accountable. The element of who relates to the entities with authority over the ecological corridor, and ecological corridors with complex tenure situations may involve many governance authorities, along with an agreed upon mechanism for coordination and oversight. When considering governance types for ecological corridors, they're in the same range of OECMs. They might be governance by government, shared governance by private individuals, organizations, or companies, and governance by indigenous peoples and or local communities. Okay, next slide, please. I want to just repeat the clear elements of the key elements of a corridor plan. We need to have a clear delineation, specific ecological objectives, also objectives related to ecosystems can be a plus, ecosystem services can be a plus. Also a plus would be to have social and economic benefits to maximize the effectiveness of the corridor. Corridors should have governance arrangements specified, and they should have a management and monitoring plan. Let's talk a little bit about corridor management. An ecological corridor management plan should articulate management actions in terms of structural needs, functional needs, and human activity management. Structural needs refers to structural ecological elements that are important to ensure the corridor meets its objective. For example, maintenance of a certain percentage of tree cover, implementation of riparian setbacks, or maintenance of in-stream habitat components such as shaded areas. Thinking really about the structural components of the corridors that need to be maintained. Functional needs refers to functional ecological elements that are important to ensure the corridor meets its objectives, and it could be to facilitate the movement of one or more wildlife species, make sure plant seed dispersal can continue, that there are free-flowing streams and rivers in the corridor. And then human activity management addresses elements in the plan designed to prevent human pressures and threats that would undermine efforts for connectivity. And as I mentioned before, the management documentation for an ecological corridor should list prohibited or permissible activities and describe any restoration needed to achieve connectivity in the corridor. All right, let's switch to monitoring. And monitoring is the collection of information, of course, about specific ecological indicators that is repeated over time to discover trends in the ecological status of a corridor and in the effectiveness of management. Monitoring provides data needed to assess the extent to which an ecological corridor is achieving its objectives. And it's often the stepchild of conservation because it takes such an effort to actually implement any kind of conservation action that often there's not really a thought or money available to then also do monitoring and make sure that the objectives are being met. But it is really important because we are still learning a lot about how these corridors really should be managed. And so monitoring is important to make sure they are functioning the way they're supposed to. All right, next slide. I mentioned early on that the connectivity guidelines recommend the establishment of a world database on ecological corridors, and different entities, including the Center for Large Landscape Conservation and the World Conservation Monitoring Center, have been collaborating across institutions to establish such a database. This image right here is just a mock-up, but when it's officially launched, the database is intended to be part of the Protected Planet and contribute towards improved understanding of how well-connected, protected, and conserved areas are globally and track progress towards connectivity conservation goals. It is currently being tested by Parks Canada as the first partner to pilot test the prototype. And we are, I think, still looking for additional partners to provide feedback to hone the structure of this database. But it is coming, it should be released pretty soon. All right, and now I'm passing it back to Lucy to talk about corridor legislation.
Yeah, thank you, Annika. So as we look at the variety descriptions and guidelines for corridors, I think in Kenya we're very aware that corridors have become an important component of what needs to be conserved. And it was interesting to look at examples of what legislation our country is putting together to support corridor conservation. And actually, we're not alone. There's quite a great number of countries there: Brazil, Costa Rica, Ecuador, India, and in the Africa region, we have Kenya and we have Tanzania. And to be good, you can go to the IUCN database and look at what each of these countries has given as a way of provision. And the main themes that you see in this corridor legislation is looking at, some of them are directives that define the criteria for the corridors and how a corridor will be defined. And in Kenya, we had our wildlife corridor report that began to define some of these areas geographically. The corridor legislation in some of these countries is also looking at the process of drafting a corridor management plan. We have been very well versed with developing park management plans, with developing conservancy management plans, with developing area management plans, even for sanctuaries and forests. But there is now possibilities of developing and drafting corridor management plans to ensure that those areas are well secured. But also, thirdly, and most importantly, the governance. So a lot of these legislation are also looking at how do you govern these spaces that sometimes straddle between different land uses and different interest groups. So corridors are really consistently being defined as complementary conservation measures. In addition to the conservation measure we are taking, corridor becomes an important additional measure of a conservation tool and a strategy. And those authorities that are needed would come from your national level to your lower administrative unit, but also much lower to your landowner unit. And I'll give one example of a corridor legislation that we looked at. There's one in Bhutan, and in Bhutan they had an executive order on the management of corridors. They identified that the status of these biological corridors, though less than protected area status, was above a government reserve forest status, and that these areas were governed by a set of rules, and they issued an addendum, and those rules were identified as rules on biological corridors, and they affected both the forest and the nature reserve in Bhutan. The level of management for those corridors was at the country level, designated and delegated to the territorial authorities. So perhaps in our case, like counties, to be the on-the-ground governance framework. And then the management plans were done at that level of governance. And then there was coordination and backstopping at the national level. So a good example to think about and see, would this be appropriate as we think of corridors in Kenya as a framework where we devolve at the county level, but the management, and I would imagine entities like WRTI that would do the monitoring, are then able to feed back the data that comes to the headquarters. We have a list. I thought it would be good to outline a list of what are the legislation we have in this country that relates to corridor. And it was quite gratifying to see that we are not really in the woods. We actually have touched on corridors in different legislation, but we've not really enveloped all of those into a package of defining a clear law, a clear governance and monitoring. But we have the Constitution of Kenya that provides for these important spaces to be the rights of every Kenyan. The Intergovernmental Relations Act identified them in some of the county areas that needed these areas secured. The Wildlife Conservation Management Act identifies the wildlife areas and dispersal, the corridors and wildlife dispersal areas. The National Wildlife Conservation and Management Policy, 2018, and indeed, which was published in 2020, also identifies the role of corridors in conservation. We have the Migratory Corridor Report, which we all, I'm sure, know about, of 2015, which we are looking at with Mohammed and others to update a new corridor atlas for Kenya, for the whole country. And the State Department has had the strategic plan that involves securing wildlife corridors, the Wildlife National Strategy of 2030, and last but not least, the Human-Wildlife Coexistence Strategy and Action Plan actually identifies fragmentation as a driver to conflict, and therefore identifying these corridors and securing them would be important also as a measure to reduce conflict. And then there are what are the legal avenues? And I'll just go in broad bullets, some legal avenues that exist, not necessarily in Kenya, but which are provided by guidelines that would form a basis for us to have a discussion on what should we adopt and what works, what fits best in our context. There's gazetting, where you have an actual designated space gazetted in law as a corridor, just like you would gazette a national park. And the IUCN connectivity guidelines appreciate this possibility and has a section on legislation that would spatially, explicitly define these areas. Secondly, you could have strategic environmental assessments and develop land use plans that are comprehensive, that integrate corridors into the SEA. When we do development, we have the strategic environmental assessment that's done, especially when you have development, but that SEA does not define corridors within it. And if you think of the classic case of the avocado farm that we had in Amboseli, the key issue that ended up in court was that the avocado farm was blocking a migratory route of wildlife from Amboseli Park going towards the north and the northeast. And whereas we don't have a framework in our SEAs to recognize corridors, we think this is an opportunity. So as people develop, as companies develop industry, roads, rails, power lines, that the SEA that's done to endorse that development identifies and recognizes and puts measures for protection of corridors. Another would be zoning areas, and that's really at local and subnational levels. And a great example for us would be the Amboseli ecosystem, who did a zoning when they did the subdivision in 2019. I have the map here, but if you look at the map they've produced, it identifies the connectivity corridors in the zonation of the greater Amboseli ecosystem. And that has become the blueprint of areas that need to be secured either with easements or with land purchase or with zoning laws. But looking backwards to say, how do we ensure those zoning laws are then legislated even as high as the National Land Commission? And those are some of the ongoing discussions, so that the great zoning plans done at the ground level are also reflected at a higher level laws. You can have private land mechanisms where you have voluntary incentives to have easements or payment for ecosystem services, or protecting traditional grazing paths. And I'll show you some pictures of how that's being done in northern Kenya. And you can also have community land mechanisms where the local authorities recognize that area as important, especially in our case for wildlife and livestock migration, and set a legislation around that for core management. And so when we look at the legal avenues, in practice, there is need to have a strong corridor protection by layering different instruments, maybe some of the ones we've just described here, that allow for these areas to be recognized, from zoning to securing the pathways that are needed, and ensuring that there's community agreement in most of these areas. Back to you, Annika.
Thank you, Lucy. Yeah, so you've heard from Lucy now there is a lot of corridor conservation already happening in Kenya. And one project I've been involved with is to develop a transboundary corridor atlas for the southern Kenya, northern Tanzania landscape, transboundary landscape. And so I want to take a closer look at some of the corridor plans in this landscape. And this was a project that we did together with WWF and a lot of other partners. It will soon be released. It will be a report and also an interactive online data viewer, atlas viewer. And so, yeah, it was a collaborative effort with many organizations and agencies sharing data and contributing during a 2-day workshop, a webinar, and providing document reviews. The atlas contains both data on structure and functional corridors. Tanzania already had mapped structural corridors, but Kenya did not have those corridors mapped yet. So to be on the same page for the whole SOCNOT landscape, we first mapped structural corridors in southern Kenya. And we did that based on the level of human modification and slope. So human modification quantifies the impact of human activities on the landscape and considers factors like population density, roads, agriculture, settlements, industrial areas. And higher human modification values indicate heavily modified areas. And so those are areas of low resistance, of high resistance to movement, and lower values indicate areas for potential corridors. We added steep slopes in there because they are avoided by many species of wildlife. And then we used least cost corridor modeling to map potential corridors. And that's how we came up with the corridors. And we then combined the structured corridors with the ones from Tanzania. And you can see the resulting network right here, with in green being the protected areas, which we combined partially into complexes because there are many abutting protected areas in the region. And then in gray, you see the modeled corridors in SOCNOT. We then assessed the functionality of these corridors for 7 focal species that you can see here. And the reason was really the structured corridors, it's a great way to come up with the first idea of where the corridors should be, but they don't necessarily work for all the different focal species. So we really wanted to know how well these structured corridors are likely to function for the different species. And so we did that in different ways. And the first way is that we computed the overlap of species locations with corridors. We created buffers that were half the maximum width of each corridor. And then we had a lot of organizations and government agencies sharing data with us, movement data and presence data of all the 7 focal species. And we summed the species occurrence points within the corridors and the buffers. And then we computed the percentage of occurrence points in the corridors versus the buffers. And we assumed that that the higher the percentage of occurrence points is in the corridor, the higher its functionality is for the species. You can see two examples right here, the Mara Complex Loita corridor and the Serengeti Complex Tarangire Complex corridor. And in green is the buffers, and you can see the occurrence points of zebras as an example here. And in white is the buffers. And so you can see, you know, how much the species is actually using the corridor versus the surrounding area. We also took different approaches and compared structural and functional connectivity model outputs, which is not quite as elegant as if you have good species data, but we didn't have species data for the entire landscape in every corridor. So instead we modeled functional connectivity and then compared the output of the functional models to the output of the structural models. And we did that in several ways. We first took the species occurrence data and environmental data to create habitat suitability models, and we converted those into resistant surfaces that show how easy or difficult it is for a species to move through a pixel in the landscape. And then we applied both circuit theory and the least cost corridor algorithm to model connectivity in the landscape. Circuit theory essentially is what it says. It's the electric circuit put into a landscape and thinking about resistance, and it will give you as a result current flow maps. So if you put a current into starting in the protected areas, how would it flow through the landscape? And it essentially models how the species would flow through the landscape. And so we compared the current flow values in the corridor to those in the buffer. We did the same thing for the output of the least cost corridor algorithm. And then we also created functional corridor maps for each of the species. And that's what we're going to focus on right here. All the details for the other methods are, of course, in the report. So what you can see in this map here are the functional corridors for elephants in this beige color, brownish, yellowish color. And in black outlines are the structural corridors. And so what you can see that is that sometimes the structure and functional corridor models match nicely, but other times the functional models indicate that the species would prefer a different corridor route. The main takeaways from this study, excuse me. The main takeaways from the study are that for the 7 focal species, some of the structural corridors appear to be functional, and they're indicated in pink here in this map, while others need adjustment. They're indicated in blue. And it could be that there has been development already in the structural corridor since they have first been delineated in Tanzania, or there could be that there's just not quite enough space for the corridor, for the wildlife in the structural corridor, but or the species might prefer another area that than the structural corridor picked. So adjustment is indicated in some areas, and then for a few corridors, here in red, connectivity is already impeded for most or all of the focal species. And all the detailed data will be able to see very shortly, I would think within a week or two, on an online viewer, so you can then zoom into the different corridors and look at the habitat suitability maps. You can look at the resistance maps. You can look at the output of the circuit flow maps and look at what it means for the different species, and also look at where the functional corridors are for the different species. I want to briefly talk about next steps and how to use the data here. And to do that, I want to ground it in a roadmap on connected landscapes and seascapes that we have been working with. And it's really just putting into a framework how to think about corridor conservation and to actually get it done. And so the first phase is to create a shared vision and assess the situation at the country or regional scale. And that has been done in Kenya, both for SOCNOT, both in SOCNOT and all of Kenya. The importance of connectivity is quite clear. And the next phase then is to model and map and prioritize the corridors. And that has now been done for SOCNOT. So next slide, Lucy. So we got check marks there, that's done. And the next part then is to create a shared vision and assess the situation at the corridor scale. So really moving from the regional, from the country scale to the corridor scale. And that needs to have a different set of a different project team, different stakeholders that are engaged. The local communities should be engaged here to build a shared understanding again and assess the situation at the local level. And then the next step is to delineate the corridors with input of rights holders and interested parties. So really engaging the local communities, developing a management and monitoring plan, providing basic documentation then to the World Database on ecological corridors once it's up and running. And that is in process in some corridors in SOCNOT, some corridors also in further in other areas in Kenya, as Lucy will be talking about. And then the next step is to really start implementing and develop a detailed short-term working plans and timelines, develop and refine a budget project and implement the management plan. So really thinking about the different scales of corridor conservation. It's really good to start at the national and regional scale, but as you all know, conservation happens on the ground. Mm-hmm. And so it's really important to work at that level of the corridor. And so we're suggesting that for each corridor, there should be a corridor coordinator who connects and engages stakeholders in developing a governance structure and a management and monitoring plan. All right. And now I'm passing it back to Lucy.
Thank you,
Annika.
Some
exam.
Thank you. And as we bring it now to a close, as she says, conservation happens on the ground. And so looking at all these models and the work that's gone on, how can we contextualize this for Kenya? There's been some ongoing work that Dr. Mohammed, who's here, and others have been part of in a mapping team, in first trying to identify these critical wildlife areas at a national level. And what you're looking at there is wildlife concentration from low to high across 40 years of data across the whole country in the wet season. And you can see your concentration in your dark, almost black, going to purple in the usual suspect places, mapping also the protected areas and the conservancies, but then looking on that map, what is the status of our corridors there? And so the work that the mapping team has been working on has identified, it's probably the first level at the national level, what are the corridors we have in Kenya and what is their status? And their status is identified in different colors of whether it is available, it has high risk of being blocked, or whether it is accessible, or whether it is not at risk or is at risk at a different level. So the green, it's very hard to see in the differentiated colors, but the small green lines are areas that have low risk, and the yellow lines are the areas that have medium risk, and the red have high risk of blockage as corridors. And we have some that are extinct, don't call corridors extinct, but are completely blocked. But then going to the next level, what we need to now do is go on the ground and identify what are the land uses in these critical corridor areas, and can we develop corridor guidelines that ensure these areas are protected. And if you look at the chart on the right, it shows for each ecosystem, the group calculated the level of threat, 1 to 5, of the corridors. And you can see Anthikapiti, as you would expect, has the highest, probably almost fully gone, but a great effort trying to reconnect it, followed by Wasonyiro, Savo, coming down to Amboselis, with Amara as the least risk. But these areas are critical for, as we said, as areas that support our wildlife in the different seasons. So having strategies that secure these corridors using different multi-layered matrix of legal provisions will be important. Again, building on the zoning with the landowners. And I'll close with 2 examples. The critical thing to know in the wildlife areas is that these corridors also serve as livestock corridors. They serve to enable people who are pastoralists move their livestock across the seasons. So in a sense, even though we sit here as conservation people, the big story on the ground is that these are critical livestock migratory routes. And in this example that I got from, again, work that Mohammed and Kifugo did, and I think this was in Ethiopia, right? And they were sitting with communities to identify their livestock grazing routes and form that as a migratory route infrastructure for wildlife and people. An example closer home is Northern Kenya, with work done by Save the Elephants and WIS Academy, where again, in a participatory manner, people identify where those corridors are on the lands that they own, and then determine the measures they want to take to secure them. And on the right, what you have is Naropura Conservancy defining this as livestock and wildlife corridors. And that ought to be how we package the work we're doing around connectivity. It's not just about wildlife, it's got to support livelihoods. And the key anchor in livelihoods here is livestock. The livestock industry in these pastoral areas has huge potential. And if we are able to leverage what they secure for their wildlife routes as areas that are also important for connectivity, for what they secure for their livestock is important for connectivity for wildlife, then it's a win-win. And I think as we go on the ground, these are the messages we want to carry, and these are the decisions we want to have that are bottom-up, really decisions driven by people and where they want these areas, how they'll use these areas, and how they'll benefit from these areas. Thank you for your time, and we will close there. Thank you, Mark.
Asante sana, Lucy. If you may, you could have a seat as we just get a feel of the questions that may be asked, sorry for the feedback, and maybe from the plenary hall. And I'm handing it to the chair of this session. I had hijacked it momentarily, Dr. Albert Longora, but I'll be assisting in getting the questions. If you have a question or comment, I'll start with you. Kuna moja hapa. Dr. Albert, unaweza ongelesha just to say good morning.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Nika and Lucy, for the keynote address. And I think what we have appreciated mostly is the role of corridors in connecting fragmented landscapes and also in enhancing human-wildlife coexistence. So it was a very insightful address. And we also want to thank you for your contribution and support to ecological connectivity and connectivity conservation planning. Thank you very much. And as you are aware, I'm Dr. Albert Longora, the chair for this Q&A session. And Lucy, you will have the esteemed company, virtual company, of Dr. Anika. I think she's online.
Yes, she is.
Yeah. So we will take questions from the participants, just as we had done yesterday. Our MC will be able to facilitate that. And we will start with the first one. Where are we? Okay. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Ambrose Letoloi. and I'm just asking Madam Lucy this question. And I did ask this question yesterday, and it seems again is coming back again. So, what measures can we be taken to protect wildlife and the ecological corridors in areas whereby infrastructure has already been developed along riparian land? And this is the infrastructure is where the government initiative have taken place. For example, dams, or for example, anything that is being put along the riparian land. Thank you.
So we can take one by one.
Yeah, just so that we don't get it lost in detail, you can just hand her this one and then you can retain this gooseneck. She can respond using that mic here.
Good morning.
Hold on,
my name
just
is
hang on, sir. Hang on. Tafadhali, wacha ajibu kwanza, alafu we'll come to you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ambrose. Where we already have infrastructure that's impeded connectivity, we may need to look at, one thought that comes to mind is the mitigation hierarchy. The mitigation hierarchy assumes that A, you're going to avoid the development that has negative repercussions on conservation. But in the event that you're not able to avoid or mitigate because the development is already in place, then we can look at offsets where we then compensate for what is lost from that infrastructure that's in place. And the idea in the mitigation hierarchy is that you're looking for a net biodiversity gain, a net gain, not just reducing loss, but ensuring you're leaving your area at a better biodiversity state than when you did the development. So in cases where development is already underway, I would say we need to, in using the mitigation hierarchy, find out an assessment of what biodiversity has been affected. How can we offset that, either by creating a new area that replaces what's been taken, or ensuring the ecological services that were being served in that area are still continuing with a different arrangement. So it needs some practical intervention, but it will be based then on an assessment on what's been lost and what measures then do we take to recover what is lost. Because in most cases, you cannot destroy the infrastructure, and so you need to see how to work around it. If a spring has been dammed, can you redirect some of that water and have it accumulate in a different place? I'm happy to hear what others think, but those would be some of my initial thoughts. But it goes back to the issue I pointed out on the SEARs. The strategic environmental assessments really need to be strengthened. I think in Kenya, our SEAR is not as strong as it should be. Secondly, the EIA consultants that do the SEAR are doing it at the behest of the developer. So in most cases, they will have to approve the development if they want it to be paid, right? So I think that's a conflict. We need to have a SEAR process independent so it can be rigorous, but also how can you create an independent body then that ensures the mitigation and the offsetting is actually being done? Because I see that we also are not really monitoring even on what is indicated in the SEARs. But the problem starts at the beginning. When those projects are approved, the considerations you're raising are not considered on the table, and they need to be with the importance that they carry.
Go ahead, sir, at the back. Let him go first. He was, yes.
Yeah, good morning. My name is Horace Wanyama. I work with the Kenya Wildlife Conservancy Association. Lucy and Anita, thanks for the detailed presentation. My question was on, your presentation was very heavy on sock knot. It covers, I think, approximately about 3 counties. So there was Taita Taveta, Kajiado, and also Narok, right? One of the recommendations of your presentation was to form a committee which will now work on corridors management plans and implementation. So my question is, for these regions, we do have very comprehensive and participatory ecosystem plans. Savo has its own Savo ecosystem plan. The same thing to Amboseli, they do have Amboseli ecosystem plan. Narok have the Greater Mara ecosystem plan, which are very recent, and they have very strong recommendation on protection of these particular corridors. So the question is, at what point have we, Kenya, both Kenya and Tanzania, attempted in implementing recommendation of those particular plans. At what point are we in implementation of recommendation of those plans, specifically on corridors? Two, do you think it's important to form another committee which will work on protection of those plans, and yet we haven't executed fully on implementing the recommendation of the ecosystem plans? Thank you.
Thank you, Horace. That's a great question. Anika, I would like her to answer on what Tanzania has done, because they've actually gone slightly ahead of us in addressing how to implement their corridor plans. And then I can speak to Kenya. Anika, are you on?
Yes, I'm on. I have a little bit of a hard time understanding everything. So, but I did hear that there's already a lot of work happening in southern Kenya, and there's a lot of ecosystem planning. I think based on our data for functional connectivity, it looks like some of the protected areas, and I should mention that our focus was really to connect existing protected areas to each other to make sure that wildlife can reach those protected areas. We did not focus on the Mara ecosystem overall, where a lot of focus is on connectivity. We really looked at connectivity between the different protected areas. And noting that there's some already impeded, and there are, however, groups that are working on addressing that. We heard about some area where there's a lot of fences, but there's still one corridor open along a riparian area, really focusing on those areas that still might be open, and protecting them as corridors might be a good way to still maintain connectivity between the protected areas.
Thanks, Anika. What I could add for Tanzania is that I know when they managed to do a full country level corridor plan and implementation strategy. So they have gone ahead in actually defining a plan to implement. In Kenya, we have not had a clear strategy for implementing our corridor and dispersal area report that was produced in 2015. We are hoping with the work of the mapping team that we will first update that with some of the maps that I was showing you on the current status of those corridors. But you're right, we need to go to the next level and say, then so what? So we've mapped, and as someone keeps saying, we can map every corridor to extinction, and that should not be the goal. We need to really have a strategy for implementing those plans. I think the ecosystems, to your point on a corridor committee, that's at the broader IUCN guideline framework. But where we have ecosystem management plans and we have a governance framework for that ecosystem, absolutely, we should then create perhaps subcommittees within it. You don't want to create another group that would run parallel to an existing group. So, and I think if you look at the case of, say, Amboseli and Mara, where their ecosystem plans have been very robust, in Amboseli, the group ranches have gone ahead to define their corridors and buffers. We then need to create a framework that supports the ecosystem plan implementers with corridor strategies for each ecosystem, with a framework for implementing, and with a group that monitors that implementation. With the report we did in 2015, there's been no monitoring of those corridors, and that's why you find 10 years later in 2025, some are fully blocked, others are threatened. The only positive news is because of the creation of conservancies, some of those conservancies have then covered areas that were earlier identified as corridors. But there's work to be done, and I think the time is now to really get on to implementation using the entities that are already in place.
So thank you. Maybe for clarity of response, you can make your questions a bit shorter and also be able to list them as...
Yeah, thank you. My name is Julius Keyu from the Tanzania Wildlife Research Institute. I just wanted to hear from them. You said it well that ecological corridors should be wide enough and should be large enough. Now in Tanzania, we have some areas where we are struggling to even buy land from community members to facilitate connectivity.
do you have a minimum recommendation of how wide a wildlife corridor should be? The second is just a comment. In Tanzania, I think in other countries also, it appears we have done almost everything. We have done the assessment, we have done the privatization, we have the action plan, and we have a process on establishment of a corridor until it is gazetted. So my comment is that it's just time for action, because we are developing a lot of documents, a lot of committees while corridors are going. Yeah, so I think that is what we need, especially political will. Thank you very much.
Okay, we can take another question.
There's a lady at the, yes. And
Thank
then
you.
one gentleman, he'd already raised his hand. Go ahead.
Good morning. My name is Anastasia Mwaura. I work for Kenya Wildlife Service. Thank you, Professor Lucy and Annika, for that wonderful presentation on corridors. I think we are long overdue, and I want to correct Horace. The Tsavo Ecosystem Plan is still ongoing, so there is a very good chance to incorporate, and I think that is one of my take-homes, that now as we are doing the management plans for parks and reserves and also the landscapes, I think we'll be more keen on the corridor report. So that's a take-home. And then also I want to say that some of the landowners, and in a recent meeting with the Athi Kapiti, they are waiting for policy, especially that because we have a challenge in Kenya in terms of land ownership of those corridors. So if we can come up with a policy that will protect some of the people are ready. And then I also support our colleague from Tanzania. I think it's time we set aside resources from government, public-private partners to have the option of buying those corridors. Thank you.
You can answer.
Okay, great. I'll answer them shortly so that we are mindful of time. Thank you, Julius, and great to see you after many years. Yes, how wide should corridor be? I think the functionality of it is as critical as the size. You can have a huge size corridor that is degraded, for example, or doesn't have the variety of habitats needed for the ecological services for the wildlife. So I think one would need to do an assessment of what are those, would we call it minimum habitat requirements. With Mohammed, we have a concept that was promoted in KWS called the minimum viable conservation area, which says we can't conserve everything everywhere, but what's the minimum that enables us to sustain and maintain the wildlife that we have? And I think that ought to be the same thinking in the corridor. What's that? Not minimum in terms of size, but minimum in terms of functionality, which then will inform the size. Well done on moving forward with action on corridors. We've been following closely what Tanzania is doing, and we hope to catch up soon. But just to say back to size, in Kenya we have one corridor that is 800 meters wide. I mean, it's like ridiculous in Kimana just for wildlife to cross. They barely make it through, but that's because everything else had been sold off. It's not ideal, and it comes with a great cost of maintenance to keep the elephants from breaking into the shambas. So it can be as narrow as it must be, if it must be, but I think looking at the minimum functionality is really what's going to be critical. Anastasia, thanks for your comment. Great to know in Tsavo, and I agree with you. If our ecosystem plans can then look at corridor management as a component, I think that's going to be a great way forward, because ecosystem plans at the lower level have a greater potential of success in implementation because they are implemented by the stakeholders of that ecosystem. And I couldn't agree with you more that we need to move forward in implementation, a policy that guides that implementation, but just to also put a caveat that let's look at the different suites of options for corridor protection. In some cases it is gazettement, in other cases it will be buying an easement, in other cases it will be setting it as a buffer within a conservancy. So I think we have many instruments and we can look at what's suitable in which area. So we are not trying to gazette and buy off, or rather gazette everyone's land as government land, but we can come up with options. And I think easements, for example, is going to be an important one, and a holding entity that can hold that land in trust.
Thank you, Lucy. I think we'll take the last three questions.
There's a gentleman who would raise his hand way at the front. How many more, sir?
Three.
Three more.
And I hope
So-
they are directed to Dr. Anika because
All right.
she's
So
actually lonely.
give me guidance. So the gentleman there, this lad here, and okay, go ahead.
So it's me? Yeah, thank you very much, Lucy and Anika, for the presentation. I have a few questions here. I will be very brief and direct. Number one, I wanted just to ask you if these corridors are intended to be only for wildlife also, or if they are also going to include livestock. What we are seeing in the data so far for the last 50 years is that livestock constitute almost 97 to 99% of all the animals found in these areas. So if livestock are going to use them, will there still be space for wildlife to use them? Number two, in delineating these corridors, as Anita explained, it seems like they're using information on occurrences of the wildlife and movements based on various kind of devices. But we know that they're shifting baselines. So like you might find that because of the way the land is being used, wildlife has been pushed to the worst parts of the landscape. So will these corridors be actually originating from, running through, and going to the worst parts of the landscape for wildlife? Number three, the transaction cost of establishing these corridors. Given that in Kenya land has been privatized in some places, the group ranches have been subdivided and now are owned by 10,000 people, how is this going to be taken into account to make it viable? And then another thing is that you said that there are so many legal mechanisms and instruments that exist that could be used to establish these corridors. It seems that despite all this, nothing is really happening. So what are your thoughts about how we can change this to make these things happen? Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe all the three questions have been asked, but we can take...
There's that young lad over there. He raised his hand first, and then his senior.
Yeah.
These two lads, and maybe one more from the gentleman here, Dr. Albert.
Yeah.
Sawa.
Then we are through.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Wycliffe Mutero from the International Fund for Animal Welfare. I think this is Dr. Keeley. The Southern Rangelands have a significant number of fences, and that is actually an understatement, especially for Central Kajiado and the Mara End. I would have liked how when you modeled how you dealt with the fences. That is one. The second one, Lucy talked about the current mapping of ecosystems in Kenya. You also showed your model work with respect to connectivity. I think it wasn't too clear. It wasn't too clear how the two exercises connect. It would be nice just to get to hear whether they are like in parallel or whether they are borrowing from each other. Thank you.
So my name is Mwendwa Katumo, working for the State Department for Wildlife. So my question is on the legal avenues for protecting the corridors. So between gazettement and land use planning and SEA, which one should be coming first? Because I want to believe that it is during the SEA that we engage the communities in those corridors. So clarity on that, please. Thank you.
Okay, do we have the last one? Or?
Hello, great overview. I'm Stotra, I'm based in Minnesota. I was wondering in your prioritization process for the corridors, is there any sort of like inclusion of the well-being and the livelihood aspirations of people in Kenya or in Tanzania for that matter? Like given a fast developing country, what sort of like human well-being measures are also being included in this prioritization process so that like we can effectively reconcile biodiversity conservation with human well-being?
Thank you. We will start with Dr. Anika. I think you will pick the ones you can answer, then Lucy will continue with what is in mind.
I'm afraid I couldn't hear.
Either because of other really a question on how the data in areas that where it originally occurred may not be where the wildlife now exists. How does that affect the delineation? Then the transaction costs in securing this corridors.
Done by Sustain East Africa of the fences and incorporated that into the model So it's up to date there. In terms of changing wildlife use, yes, the landscape is changing rapidly. And I think because we used models and because we used the most up-to-date satellite imagery and information on fences and on other developments, we're hoping that we got it as good as possible, but of course, ongoing monitoring and observations on the ground will always be needed to inform